Looking for the numbers to go up. There we go. Good morning, everybody. I'm Andrea Durkin. I'm the president of the Washington Women in International Trade DC chapter. It's a crisp morning here in DC. Thanks for joining us. This is our second event in a series that's designed to shine light on important new work that's going on to disaggregate trade data so that we can better understand how women trade, the barriers that they face, and most importantly, what our panelists are going to be discussing today, which is how to catalyze change through policies that support women traders. And we're privileged to be joined today by Jose Antonio Montero from the WTO, by Kendall Hembroff, who's the Director General of Trade Policy and Negotiations with the Government of Canada, and also Livia Shmavonian, a Senior Advisor for Senator Bob Casey. And I know we have a global audience today, so while people are still in the process of joining, I want to mention that Women in International Trade, the DC chapter, is the largest in the global WIT network. We have almost 700 members. And in the age of COVID, we are still delivering programming robustly this fall, even though we can't meet together. We're doing it virtually. And I'm really excited. We're rolling out a unique professional development programming in the fall, and it's going to run all the way through the spring. So I want to encourage people who aren't yet members to join WIT. And also, this is a great time because this Thursday we're holding a virtual awards ceremony to celebrate the contributions of women in our field. So I encourage you to register and join the festivities. We're going to have a lot of fun. We have actually cooking demos from embassy chefs as part of the festivities. And there's a lot more this fall, so check out our programming online. We're really determined to support each other in this age of COVID right now. We're going to support each other professionally and personally. And I'm really delighted that as we're doing that internally as an association, today we're taking the moment to turn our focus outward toward those whom trade policy is intended to benefit all around the world. And that's half the population, which is women. And we know that there's a lot more that we can be doing to make sure that women benefit from our trade policies from liberalization. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lisa Schroeder. She's running the program today. Lisa is a past WIT president. She is also the current president of the WIT Charitable Trust. And if you're not familiar, the trust works to encourage students, particularly in the DC metropolitan area, to help on-ramp to trade careers, to develop those skills. So we're grateful to her work there. And panelists, I just want to say thank you, and we really look forward to your comments. So Lisa, over to you.
Andrea, thank you so much. And thanks to everybody for joining today. As Andrea said, kind of a chilly morning, but we've been reflecting on that too. I think particularly for those of us in DC at the moment, the legacy of Ruth Bader Ginsburg looms really large. And one of the great things about when you see the tributes to her life, there's very much a focus on action. And that's exactly what we've been threading through these conversations that we started back in July, is to really bring together what is some outstanding research and data work that's happened, particularly between the World Bank and the World Trade Organization, but really use that to crystallize conversations around what does it mean and what can we be doing? Where are things working? Where are programs driving real progress? And how can we bring that more into our own areas of expertise and work? So I know we've got an amazing panel that can really talk through very tangible examples of what's being done to support women in trade and how trade policy and other government measures can really help be part of that solution space, how we do better to make sure that 50% of the world's population really has access to economic empowerment and opportunities. So we're going to start that conversation off with Jose Antonio Montero from the World Trade Organization, an economist with the Economic Research and Statistics Division. But Jose really has extraordinary experience through everything that we'll be talking about through this morning, having started his career at the International Labor Organization, working exactly on these economic issues and how labor can really be impacted by regional trade agreements. He brought that talent to the WTO, working not only on labor, economic statistics and analysis, but also the role and the impact of environmental policies. He's the author of a recent book on making globalization more inclusive, a topic we all spend a lot of time talking about. And especially as we think about what that means and what can be done, he's really one of the driving authors behind a project that we were talking about starting with a panel yesterday, the World Bank WTO report on trade, gender empowerment through trade. Chapter 3 really dives into, of that report, really dives into the role that government can play, especially the positive and constructive opportunities to make real progress. So Jose, why don't you tell us what that really means, and we'll start our discussion.
Thank you, Lisa, and with DC for the organization of this session. I'm very happy to be virtually here with you. So as you mentioned, the World Bank and the WTO launched the joint report on trade in women in late July. And the report highlights that international trade does indeed benefit women. However, the benefits are not always automatic because many women continue to face higher barriers in international trade than men. So one important question that the report addresses is how these barriers can be removed. And so the report concludes that women's economic empowerment through international trade cannot be fully materialized without the collective efforts and engagement of all the relevant stakeholders, including governments, private sector, and international organizations. And so the report discusses the important role for governments, noting that there is no one-size-fits-all set of policies to ensure women can fully benefit from trade opportunities. So some policies aim at increasing women's market access. So these policies are mostly trade policies. Think of, for instance, removing the so-called pink tariff that affects the sectors where women work, and that could bring them closer to international markets if those tariffs were removed. Opening up key sectors, such as services where women are highly active, can also create new trading opportunities. Other important trade policy include promoting trade finance for small and medium-sized enterprises and implementing also the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement. The report notes that some countries, such as Canada and Chile, have also incorporated comprehensive explicit gender provision in their trade agreement. And so some other economies, such as the European Union, for instance, have adopted unilateral trade preference programs that grant lower tariff to exporting developing countries, provided they comply with specific international convention, including the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. Although trade policy is very important, it is to some extent the tip of the iceberg of all the relevant policies to support women engaged in trade. In fact, if you think about trade policy cannot overcome discriminatory legal and cultural barriers that may prevent some women from opening a bank account or crossing the border in some countries. And so there are other broader policies that can increase women's capacity to engage in international trade. And so these include policies aimed at promoting or improving women's access to higher education, digital technology, finance, information, and transport in infrastructure. In parallel, given that trade opening can lead to some disruption in the labor market, because some sectors tend to expand while others tend to contract, adjustment policies are also very important to mitigate the risk from trade faced by women. And so adjustment policies can take different forms, including labor market adjustment policies such as skill development programs. In that context, the report notes that some economies, such as Canada and the European Union, conduct gender impact assessment of their future trade agreements, looking at the potential trade impact on women through different dimensions, including the labor market. And so the result of such gender impact assessment can be used to tailor labor market adjustment policies and help women adjust to new economic conditions. The report also looks at the role of the private sector, noting that several companies have adopted their own initiatives to promote gender equality. In some cases, these initiatives are gender specific, and in other cases, they are part of the company's broader corporate social responsibility strategy. Finally, the report discusses the role of international cooperation, in particular, the role of international organization. And so the WTO and the World Bank, in their respective functions, have a role to play. At the WTO, ongoing negotiation and initiatives related to services, agriculture, electronic commerce, and small, medium-sized enterprises can contribute to remove some of the barriers that women face. The transparency mechanism of the WTO can also help promote the transparency of gender-related trade policy. Several members have already used the WTO trade policy review mechanisms to voluntarily share information on women and trade. The WTO-led initiative Aid for Trade is also used by some donors and recipient governments to promote women economic empowerment through trade in developing countries. And finally, the WTO, in collaboration with other international organizations, is engaged in the collection of gender-related statistics. And so for this report, we released a unique data set that provides labor data by gender at the industry level for a large number of countries, as well as a new database on gender provision in preferential trade agreement. And so this is an important contribution because we know that well-designed and well-implemented strategies to enhance women's economic benefit from trade hinge on the availability of relevant gender trade data. Thank you.
Jose, thank you so much. That's such a great example and really kind of the world of opportunity that we're here talking about today, especially when you think about how much those policy provisions can really have a very direct impact, especially in these times. As you mentioned, many of the sectors, hardest hit in this economy tend to be areas where there is a strong preference or a strong, participation of women in the marketplace, travel and tourism, for example. We're really thrilled that we can have this panel discussion as well, and honored that Kendall Hembroff was able to join us, as well as Livia, because as we said at the outset, this is really about getting to what are the concrete measures. So Kendall is the Director General of Trade Policy Negotiations, as well as the Chief Negotiator for the Pacific Alliance and India negotiations for Canada. In that role since August 2018, Ms. Hembroff has the responsibility for overseeing the negotiations of Canada's bilateral and regional trade agreements, also all the elements of related initiatives at multilateral trade policy levels, such as WTO, OECD, G20, APEC. So quite literally covering the world. In that role, Kendall's really been responsible, having previously worked on trade agreements such as the CPTPP, as well as exploratory talks with Canada, and was Canada's lead negotiator for the WTO General Agreement on Trade and Services. Again, a number of the sectors and areas of impact that Jose was just speaking to. And I really appreciate that your career at Global Affairs Canada, covering such a broad remit of negotiations, ongoing discussions, multilateral initiatives, but also includes the time that you had spent overseas earlier on in your career, working as consul and senior trade commissioner at the Consul General in Hong Kong, where clearly would have been a lot of experience doing exactly what we're talking about, how to help companies, women and men owned, really take advantage of market access opportunities. Kendall, would love to hear your thoughts on how Canada is really integrating these gender measures into the very trade policy agenda that you're driving so much attention on. Thank you.
Great, and good morning, everyone. It's really wonderful to be able to participate in this session today and to be able to talk about Canada's inclusive approach to trade. This has really been a journey for us, and I would hesitate to call this a completed work. It's something where we are continuing to learn, and it is really sessions like this actually that provides us with the opportunity to receive some feedback and hopefully even make some changes in terms of some of the things that we're looking at as part of our inclusive approach to trade. Trade liberalization has been a significant stimulus to economic growth and prosperity around the world, including in Canada. However, we recognize that trade has affected various groups and members of society differently based on a whole wide range of factors, including gender. And so it was through consultations with Canadian stakeholders and experts, as well as some of our own research, where we found that women indeed do face many unique barriers to trade that inhibit their ability to be able to access opportunities that trade agreements are intended to create. These barriers include everything from less access to financing, limited access to networks and global value chains, and also explicit as well as implicit discrimination. And so when we first started looking at this 5 years ago, I have to say, there were some doubts in terms of whether or not trade agreements, did have a gender impact. But when we started to look at a detailed examination of the data and identified trade barriers, it really did challenge our basic assumptions. And we did come to the conclusion that trade agreements are not gender neutral. As I said, this is really a work in progress. We're still continuing to learn. We are experimenting, and we do recognize that there's a lot more that can be done. And it is, key to this really is engagement with women that are engaged in international trade to hear about their experiences, but also finding like-minded partners internationally that are willing to experiment with trade policy and see whether or not there are ways in which our trade agreements can better support women. The full and equal participation of women in the economy is essential to Canada's future competitiveness and prosperity. Our economy and our country simply can't reach its full potential if we're leaving people behind. We have women entrepreneurs, which are still very much underrepresented in the Canadian economy. And even though this gap is now starting to close between women-owned and men-owned exporting firms in Canada, women still demonstrate lower export intensity and report greater difficulty securing capital, contracts, talent, expertise, mentorship, and leadership opportunities compared to men. Our analysis suggests that advancing women's equality in Canada could add up to $150 billion to the GDP by 2026, which is a very sizable number. And so that's why we've been advancing gender provisions across our free trade agreements by seeking both standalone trade and gender chapters, but also finding opportunities where we can incorporate gender-related provisions across the entire agreement. And I'll talk a little bit more about that today because I think it's really important. We also employ a gender-based analysis, or GBA+, to help us identify risks and opportunities in advancing various negotiating proposals. In fact, we recently published a summary of the GBA+ that we prepared for the very first time to one of our trade agreements for our ongoing FTA negotiations with Mercosur, and that can be found on the Global Affairs Canada website if anyone's interested in taking a look. We've also published a GBA+ on CUSMA. And so this is very early days for us, but we do seek the feedback of Canadians in publishing this analysis. And our effort is to try to identify as best as possible where there may be potential gaps in our trade agreements. We have also been very active, as was mentioned earlier, in negotiating gender provisions in our various agreements. It was in June 2017 that for the first time we included a trade and gender chapter when we modernized our free trade agreement with Chile. That was, of course, building on some of the early work that Chile and Uruguay had done, and we found that quite helpful in terms of stimulating our own thinking about how we might approach a gender chapter. Similarly, when we modernized our free trade agreement with Israel, we also included a trade and gender chapter, and that entered into force in September of 2019. With the European Union, we have adopted a trade and gender recommendation, which effectively has the same status as a chapter. And together, the agreements that we have with Chile, with Israel, with the European Union, and are pursuing also with other ongoing trade negotiations, these chapters essentially do a couple of things. They are intended to recognize the importance of mutually supportive trade and gender policies and incorporating gender into trade. They are aimed at recognizing the importance of implementing international instruments that advance gender equality and women's economic empowerment. They establish a framework to undertake a whole variety of different cooperation activities. And they establish a dedicated bilateral committee to oversee the activities and review implementation of the chapter. We are actively implementing these commitments with our trading partners because, of course, our job is not done when we negotiate the provisions. We have to take a very active role in terms of implementing. We've also been working to try to remove barriers to women in international trade at the WTO. And many of you may be aware that we played a strong role in both drafting and advancing the Declaration on Trade and Women's Economic Empowerment that draws inspiration from the trade and gender chapters that we've negotiated in our free trade agreements. This declaration acknowledges the need to develop evidence-based interventions that address a whole range of barriers. We've also been actively working with WTO members to try to advance trade and gender into the work of the WTO. Some of you may be aware of a proposal that we advanced in the context of the work of the WTO on domestic regulation to try to ensure that in applying licensing and qualification requirements and procedures that we are not discriminating against women. And then stepping outside of the WTO, most recently, we've signed a new global trade and gender arrangement with Chile and New Zealand, which was an offshoot of some CPP discussions that we had where we're trying to work together to be able to advance trade and gender common objectives in a variety of different international organizations, such as the WTO. There are nearly 200 countries in the world, though, and so our goal is to try to work with more like-minded countries on some of these objectives. So that we can ensure that more women can make a difference in our countries and into the global trading environment. So maybe I'll end my brief comments here and look forward to the Q&A session.
Thank you, Kendall. That's a lot of really good food for thought there. And Livia, I know you've got some really great comments to add from the congressional side. We're thrilled that you're able to join us. Livia Shimovian, who's the Democratic Staff Director to the Finance Subcommittee on International Trade, Customs, Global Competitiveness, also a senior advisor to Senator Bob Casey. In that role, Livia has advised the senator on USMCA trade negotiations, and again, with full credit to all parties for agreeing to a gender diversity chapter there, as well as 2017 tax reform legislation and all areas of domestic and international economic policy. Prior to working for Senator Casey, Livia was working in the offices of Congressman Jim McDermott and Jim Langevin on the Hill. So a really good sense of where, coming at it from that legislative perspective, we can really look to drive real change and a better way forward on trade policy, as Kendall's describing from Canada too. Livia, would welcome your thoughts on where you see these priorities.
Yeah, Lisa, thank you for the invitation to speak and participate in this panel. Kendall, it's a real pleasure to be following you in this presentation. I'll make the necessary disclaimer that the views expressed here are my own and do not necessarily represent those of the senator. I plan to provide some general remarks and then discuss some of the proposals and initiatives that we're undertaking. As we've covered, trade touches just about every aspect of an economy. Our trade policies should support the objective that men and women should have equal opportunity to reach their full potential and full economic participation. That means women need to have the right to own property, to form a business, to open a bank account, to access institutions, to get an education, to work, to divorce, and to have custody rights and inherit, to name a few. Fundamentally, the rights of women are not peripheral to economic participation and growth. They are central to a free and fair society and a strong and prosperous economy. We know that when women participate in labor force, economies grow, and when countries repress wages and hold down labor costs by engaging in discrimination against women or discrimination in general, this harms workers everywhere, including economies in that home country. Discrimination in any form should not be a competitive advantage, and the work we are undertaking now is to try and address some of these issues. As Kendall covered, there has been a presumption that trade is gender neutral, and as we are finding, that is simply not the case. Provisions can impact lives and livelihoods of men and women differently, and trade provisions can impact labor force participation and status of work differently for men and women. Just one example, and something that we're really focused on, is that the expansion of trade flows can result in defeminization along the value chain of traded goods. So as jobs become more desirable, men can push women out of those positions, and women in turn are either pushed into lower wage jobs or into the informal sector. So even when you liberalize trade in certain areas, that can actually result in disproportionate impacts on women in the labor force and their income. There is no single policy to fix the challenges globally. And to Kendall's point, you know, we all need to be working together in order to advance international economic policies that can help advance equal protection under the law for women. It's not simply a matter of economic efficiency, but one of fairness and human rights. But on the economic point, as stated earlier, it's to no one's advantage to provide preferential trade access to countries that restrict full economic participation to half their population. So we've spent the last year putting together legislation and policy proposals to incorporate the rights of women across US trade laws and practices. Senator Casey, along with Senator Cortez Masto, have introduced legislation to modernize our trade preference laws, generalized system of preferences, and they also put forward 6 pillars at an event on the Council of Foreign Relations earlier this summer. So the legislation to modernize GSP is called Women's Economic Empowerment and Trade Act, S4007. It will incorporate measures on the rights of women and equal protection under the law into GSP, non-discrimination, violence and harassment in the workplace, including gender-based violence and harassment, and also human rights. The bill also creates a supplemental review mechanism within GSP that looks to the statutes in place in GSP recipient countries related to the rights of women and also worker rights. We build off of the work that the World Bank has done in their Women, Business, and Law report in that effort. It also will establish clear guidelines for countries to meet measures, and it provides USTR authority to reduce GSP benefits by amount deemed appropriate after 5 years. So we're establishing clear guidelines and measures. We're providing technical assistance for countries to meet those measures, and also creating a timeline by which countries need to elevate their own standards and statutes in this instance. The pillars, I'll try to get through these quickly so that we can move on to the discussion. Number 1, rights of women and workers first. Countries must meet baseline standards on the rights of women and worker rights before the United States engages in FTA talks. 2, binding and enforceable commitments in future trade agreements. The United States should incorporate binding provisions on gender and trade in future agreements. This could be in the form of a gender chapter, or as we might discuss later, incorporated throughout the agreement. 3, binding commitments on equal protection, non-discrimination, and violence and harassment in the workplace. All trade measures, including GSP and our preference programs, must include binding provisions on equal protection and the rights of women, and measures consistent with the ILO conventions on non-discrimination and violence and harassment in the workplace. 4, development for development. Countries should have laws supporting full and free economic participation and fundamental worker rights. Over time, failure to meet these measures would result in a reduction in benefits. 5, strong enforcement and capacity building. Countries must have the resources they need to meet the commitments to improve conditions for workers and women. And 6, adequate representation at the table. Women and civil society groups must be part of the decision-making process from the start. They must be at the table. This is something the ITC has worked diligently towards, and a point that was of discussion at yesterday's panel. So these measures are all intended to support the central objective of women's full economic participation globally. I'll repeat the point I made earlier. When a country can repress wages and use discrimination to hold down the cost of production, that harms workers everywhere, including in that home country. On a personal note, I think it's also important to approach these efforts with a sense of humility and also with a sense of history. My grandmother grew up in the United States when women didn't have the right to vote. My mom grew up in the United States when women couldn't open a bank account with a man's signature, rent a car, rent an apartment, or buy a house. And we still have some work to do, but that shouldn't constrain our efforts to ensure US trade laws support and uphold as a core objective that men and women have equal opportunity and equal protection under the law. And hopefully the work that we're doing here and hopefully future collaborations will be in furtherance of that goal. Lisa, I'll turn it back to you and thank you for the time.
Absolutely, Olivia. Thank you for those great comments, especially kind of real action, real proposals. But I love that personal touch there. I can still remember when I signed my first apartment rental agreement, my mom cried because when she had tried to do that as a divorced mother, she had to have her father sign for it back in 1968. So we've come a long way. We still have a long way to go. And I'm curious, a reminder for all the audience too, everybody's very familiar with the Zoom technology these days. We are going to open this up for Q&A. I've got a couple prepped, but I know you guys always have great ideas too. And Kendall put that call to action out early on of other ideas, best practices, or things anybody wants to contribute to the discussion. Please feel free to use the chat or the Q&A, and we'll incorporate those ideas into the discussion. Maybe to kind of lead us off, you know, Kendall, you mentioned $150 billion by 2026. I mean, women's empowerment and clearly has economic opportunities for countries. Jose, you've crunched the numbers on this. You know, I'm curious your sense of, or your recommendations around, you know, knowing that the economic argument makes so much sense. How do we do more to build more political engagement, leadership, to prioritize women's empowerment as part of the overall trade agenda? How do you see opportunities? I think, Jose, as you mentioned too, it's not only political leadership, but, you know, efforts in the private sector. You know, how can we do more to move this from a discussion that everybody, you know, talks about supporting, but we really need to see more action? What have been some of your experiences and lessons learned? Kendall, do you maybe want to kick that off? You're on mute.
All right, I'll get this right. Yeah, I mean, I'll start by saying that it absolutely requires leadership from the top. And certainly in a Canadian context, I mean, that has come, you know, all the way from our Prime Minister, our now Deputy Prime Minister, who at the time was our Minister of International Trade, our Minister of Foreign Affairs, our Minister of Trade. I mean, absolutely, we have to have political, not just support, but I would say leadership, that this is important, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it actually makes economic sense. And so that has really been very critical, I think, to our success in terms of moving this forward. And so when it became part of our mandate back in 2015, you know, that required us to do a number of things. You know, suddenly it became mandatory for us in all public policies under consideration in the Government of Canada, including trade policy and trade agreements, but to conduct a GBA plus assessment. And so, you know, I remember when we were first sitting down with our various negotiators, you know, talking about what this would mean in terms of doing this for a trade agreement. And, you know, there were lots of questions about, you know, where to start. And, you know, people felt, you know, okay, well, they're not, you know, we're not gender experts. We're, you know, we've been negotiating trade agreements for, you know, decades. You know, where do we start? And so a big part of our success actually was providing coaching to our negotiators, bringing in expertise from the outside, to help us walk through the kinds of considerations that we needed to be looking at. You know, we spent a lot of time in terms of brainstorming and, you know, doing some, you know, creative thinking about how we might be able to approach different issues. And as I mentioned, experimentation. We've also been, I think, I think, very successful in terms of being able to learn from other countries that either have been experimenting with provisions in their trade agreements or looking at trade and gender more generally. And so, for example, we've been a very active member at the WTO through the International Gender Champions Network, which I think is actually meeting today to be able to talk about what we might be able to do. This is a group made up of ambassadors to the WTO, including the Canadian ambassador. We've worked with experts, think tanks, researchers that have been working on this for many years. So, I think a big part of this, I guess, is a willingness to be able to learn and do a little bit of risk taking. But certainly in our case, we have had not only support, but I think really strong encouragement from the top, and that's made a big difference.
Definitely can see that'd be really impactful. And Jose, I'm curious, in terms of knowing that the report launched at the end of July, kind of that same putting out the data sets, the economic rationale to this. Do you see this really moving the needle, especially as so many countries struggle now with re-energizing their economies?
Absolutely. In fact, prior to the launch of the report, we also did a study on the impact of COVID on women. And we find that women workers might be more affected than men because of all the different measures adopted by governments to tackle the pandemic. And so you talked about it before, about tourism, retail, and so on, fashion industry. These are sectors where women tend to be more active, more represented. And so it is important to ensure that in a way that the recovery takes into account women. And as you mentioned, it makes economic sense. So even if you put aside your cultural beliefs, economically it makes sense. And so there are, in a way, I agree that clearly because also for the report, I also looked at gender provision in preferential trade agreement, and you can really see some outliers, some countries that are more proactive, and clearly there is some leadership, political leadership behind it. But it's also, I think, important to acknowledge the role of women's organization, who for many years have been, in a way, fighting and promoting the importance of taking into account the gender dimension of trade agreement. And this discussion has moved over the years. Before it was, at the national level, and it moved to international discussion whether it's in the WTO or at the United Nations. And so it's also important to acknowledge that contribution. Yeah.
I think that's a really great point. We've been as DAO, we've been participating in the B20 Women in Business Task Force that was set up under Saudi's chairmanship of the G20 this year. And it's been a really good example, very tangible example of what you're talking about, Jose. And I have to say, I've been truly amazed with just the women's business community, particularly from the Gulf, participating in that task force, how active and engaged. And it speaks a lot to sort of the role that women can play in kind of driving, not just that political leadership and the adoption of these measures, but then really looking to take full advantage. Livia, I'm curious, do you have comments about the best practices or ways of building that political engagement and leadership as you've worked on these legislative initiatives?
Yeah, thank you. I think to Kendall's point, it's a lot about education, right? And educating ourselves. Many of us we've all worked in the trade space for quite a while, and women's rights has not necessarily been an area that we've traditionally engaged in, or that there's a wealth of expertise on in terms of the intersectionality of those two issues. And so in embarking on this effort, I certainly relied on a lot of outside experts and a lot of folks who've been working in this space for much longer than I have in the general arena of advancing the rights of women in global development. and working with them to really understand and consider how best to apply those measures and practices to our trade laws. And that is still a work in progress. And we have, fortunately, examples from other countries in the international community who have undertaken these efforts and have actually incorporated some of these measures in their own trade agreements. And so, to the extent that we don't need to reinvent the wheel, that's fantastic, right? You know, and so I think there really is a really significant opportunity for collaboration and coordination and work with our allies and partners.
Definitely really strong themes, the transparency, the partnership, the collaboration, making this a more collective effort really obviously does go a long way. And I'm curious, I wanted to reflect, I know we've talked a lot about kind of the policy initiatives, you know, getting these binding commitments, you know, getting, driving real change on the ground. But a big element of this actually making this work for women is, you know, when you think about the implementation side, you know, one part is the laws and the policies, but the other is helping the women's economic community be able to take advantage of these commitments. I'm curious how you see translating these policy approaches into those kind of tangible benefits and helping women get more involved. Is that an issue of education, implementation? You know, we've talked about finance, access to resources. ITC yesterday talked about their She Trades program. That's really kind of that education element to bring women into this space. What's been your experience in terms of, you know, as we get these policy measures adopted, how to really help then the women's business community take advantage and get more involved?
Who do you want to answer that?
Kendall, why don't you take a first shot at that, please?
Sure. Okay. Well, I should say, I am a trade negotiator for most of my career, although I've spent a little bit of time working in the Canadian Trade Commissioner Service, as you mentioned, in Hong Kong. I would say in the last 5 years or so, we have tried to better link up those two things. And so what I mean by that is making sure that the businesses for whom we are negotiating these trade agreements are aware that they exist, are aware of how they can take advantage of them, and that they're provided with the right services in order to be able to do so. And so I mentioned earlier that a big part of what we've included in our trade and gender chapters is related to cooperation activities that we can undertake to help you know, small and medium-sized enterprises, for example, and women businesses to be able to take better advantage of these agreements. You know, we have committed as a government to promoting business development services specifically for women, and have developed programs to improve women's digital skills, for example, and access to online business tools. We have led women-focused business delegations, where we've had Canadian women-owned businesses that can access supplier diversity programs, be connected with leading corporations that are committed to doing business with diverse suppliers. We support participating business women with pre-departure and on-the-ground knowledge and insight. You know, we have, for example, in the context of CETA, which is our trade agreement with the European Union, we've held business women's delegations to Germany and the UK back in 2018. We've also led, similarly, women's business delegations to France and Belgium earlier this year before the pandemic. And we've also had women-focused business delegations to the United States, including at key supplier events such as Go for the Greens and Women's Business Enterprise National Council, National Conference, and business fairs. So, you know, I think I'm just giving some examples of the kinds of things that we're doing, but we're trying to make sure that, you know, that the provisions that we're negotiating in our trade agreements are more than just the words on the page. They have to be implemented, and we have to be working in lockstep with our colleagues that are directly providing services to Canadian business.
Yeah, I'll add, you know, the GSP proposal is obviously not law yet, but we focused on statutes for a reason, and that's because you need to do the first things first, right? There are a lot of GSP countries that don't have basic laws on the books related to women's economic empowerment and participation. In fact, there are many GSP countries that have laws on the books that hinder that effort, right? And so while statutes aren't everything, clearly they're not, you need points of leverage for civil society, and that is a significant point of leverage, is actually making sure that the objectives that we want to see executed in countries are supported by the laws of the land in that country. And this also goes back to, I think, something that was discussed yesterday in the panel, which is making sure you have the right people in the room, making sure that civil society and women are engaged from the start and really know and understand what is being discussed and negotiated in either trade agreements or other measures. We are currently undertaking a review through GIO of US statute and US trade practices and what we have incorporated directly or indirectly related to the rights of women. Hopefully that will be out later this year, and that I think and I hope will help spur the conversation, at least in the United States and among policymakers, about not to presume, but we've all looked at US trade law, right? So we have a pretty good idea that there's not a lot there right now.
Very, very fair points. And it would seem to, especially coming at it from that GSP angle, there's a great way of tying in some of the priorities of just US development work, USAID or TDA. That can be real hand on the ground training. And I know, to give full credit to Canada and our sister WIT chapter up in Toronto, I know they've held a couple of great webinars around the gender chapters in the trade agreements, how those can create opportunities and how women-owned businesses should really be looking in more depth. So when we're back in a more physical world again, I think I can safely commit for WIT. We'd always love to be meeting with Canadian business delegations, especially when they come here. That interaction is so critical to being able to move this forward. I think one of the other elements we've talked a lot in this discussion, obviously, has been around the data elements of making the case and really demonstrating where policy can have an impact. And Kendall, you talked about the GBA Plus approach. I'm very curious, that initiative and how you see opportunities for partnership on that at the multilateral level. And similarly, Jose, with all the work that you've done on data and the report, what efforts the World Bank and the WTO could bring together to kind of help drive more of this multilateral engagement. Maybe Jose, if you want to go first from the report, and then Kendall.
Well, thank you. So in a way, the report is the first step. So it's in a way we are committed to work on trade and gender, and this was the first time we took some time to look at the situation. As it was mentioned before, I mean, we often thought that trade policy is gender neutral, and so we looked at what was the landscape in terms of empirical evidence, and it turns out that there is a real lack of data, gender disaggregated data. So we will try to work to look at different sources of information that provide gender disaggregated data. And so, as I mentioned, for the report, we released this data set on labor, on employment by gender, and we also used different survey data that provide information by gender, and which is also available online. And this is the type of information that is really needed to, in a way, to assess and also to design gender policies, and even if not gender policies in general, but any policy, if you want to assess its impact on women, you need the gender dimension to be able to assess it and show whether it works or whether it doesn't work. And the data collection is something that we are definitely working on, at least from the WTO side, and the World Bank also on different other issues. You know, the World Bank and the WTO are two different bodies, and they have different functions. And the World Bank has many programs that promote women, women owners. SMEs, and in the WTO we are also doing some technical assistance, but it's a different type of technical assistance, more about teaching about the relationship between trade and gender, and in a way it's an ongoing work, and it's in a way it's just the beginning.
Okay, well, maybe I can follow that up and just say, I mean, you know, we have taken the opportunity to talk about our approach to trade and gender in our trade agreements, including the GBA plus assessment. You know, whenever we're engaged with an FTA partner in bilateral or regional negotiations, we've talked about opportunities to share best practices on how we've gone about that. We, whether it's at the G20 or at APEC or the OECD or the WTO, are also always willing to talk about our experience in these areas. I mean, we're very new in terms of connecting GBA plus assessments of our trade agreements and negotiating these provisions. So I think we don't pretend to be the expert, but I think that we're certainly a willing learner and willing to share our experiences. You know, on the development side of things, more specifically, certainly I think the WTO's Aid for Trade can play a really important role in terms of supporting women's economic empowerment and also helping developing countries to identify areas where their trade policies could be improved to be more gender responsive. We support the WTO Aid for Trade initiative. We also have a feminist international assistance policy that puts a lot of emphasis on gender in terms of the work that we're doing in terms of development programming. And so, you know, our aim is to be able to work with emerging economies, whether they're developing or least developed countries, to be able to try to make their trade policies more gender responsive.
Absolutely. And I know we've talked a lot about kind of the role that the WTO can play in this space. We've been lucky enough to host two great fire starter conversations with two of the potential candidates now in the second round, candidates for Director General. Both Dr. Ngozi and Amina Mohammed spent some time with us. So I'm very curious your sense, if you had a wish list thinking ahead to 2021, and given the fact that we might have the more feminist leadership at the very top of the WTO. You know, Kendall, you mentioned the Buenos Aires principles. You know, there've been a lot of effort to really build this conversation. Jose, you'd mentioned the role that digital services play and can impact women disproportionately. You know, those are negotiations that are going on as well. What would be your wish list? Do you see opportunities for the WTO to do more in a 2021 context, heading to a ministerial, to take up and really advance these issues?
So I think it's, oh, sorry, was that for Jose Antonio? If so, I will stop.
No, well, we're
No,
this
go
time.
ahead.
We'll let you go first and then Jose.
Okay, I was going to say, I think it's really exciting that the WTO has been able to attract some really fantastic female candidates. I don't know at the end of the day whether any of those candidates will prevail, but I mean, the fact that the WTO has not yet had a female director general, and we now have some incredibly talented and qualified women that are vying for that job, I think I think bodes really well for the future of the organization. You know, I think in terms of my wish list, obviously we have the next WTO ministerial conference that I think does provide us with the opportunity to really focus on what it is that we think we can do. I think most people who follow these discussions will recognize that the WTO has a lot on its plate at the moment. You know, whether it's discussions on fish subsidies or e-commerce or fixing the woes of the dispute settlement system. But certainly we hope that we will be able to use the upcoming ministerial meeting to be able to launch a proper process under the rubric of the WTO that allows us to look at what we might be able to do. And, I don't know whether that will be a standalone initiative on trade and gender that provides a little bit more teeth to the work that's already been done on women's economic empowerment, or whether that might actually involve taking a look at very specific initiatives and negotiations and seeing where we can incorporate a gender perspective. I did talk earlier about the proposal that we've made in the work on domestic regulation, which we think could make a really big difference in terms of ensuring that women don't face barriers when it comes to licensing and qualifications requirements on the basis of gender. But I think there's a lot more that we can do in areas like that, whether it's trade and services, trade facilitation. So I think that we need to really take a really careful look at our trade agreements and the agreements that we're in the process of negotiating, and make sure that we are looking at things from a gender perspective.
Great ideas. Jose?
Yeah, so, in my case as a WTO employee, I cannot say much, but, the WTO is I do a lot of webinars and teaching, and often I feel people think that the WTO is the police and is checking what countries are doing and so on. And in fact, no, the WTO is a member-driven organization. So if you ask me what to expect for next year, to me, I would only hope that governments, WTO members, make decisions that benefit the most and that are inclusive. And me as a WTO employee and working in the WTO Secretariat, we are in a way only here to serve the membership and to act on what the members decided. So I hope that, as it was mentioned before, there is a lot of turbulence right now in the WTO, and my personal hope is that we get to to some progress, advance in the negotiation, because as you mentioned before, it makes economic sense to include women in the workforce. It makes sense to open to trade and at the same time put in place adjustment policies in order to facilitate and mitigate the adjustment process that follows opening to trade.
Absolutely. And I know we just have a couple of minutes or 2 minutes left for our time from the panel. And I want to make sure to give all three of you amazing contributors a chance to, do any kind of quick closing comment that you want to make. As we've really talked about, we see these discussions, and I think, Kendall, you said it best in the beginning. This is about brainstorming and sharing. Livia, you mentioned it. There's no single policy here. This is a work in progress, and we really want these discussions, especially where we can point to, real tangible actions and the benefits that they bring. We want to use this to continue to catalyze the discussion. More importantly, catalyzing the actionable agenda. So I'd love if there's a takeaway that you see we should be thinking about as we continue to kind of build these conversations. We'd welcome quick closing thoughts. Livia, maybe I can call on you first.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. Thank you for organizing this and for really driving the conversation and keeping this top of mind for folks in the trade space. As we're embarking on these efforts, I hope we can continue to collaborate across the board with folks to discuss what's worked, what hasn't worked, best practices, so that we can, avoid mistakes that were made in the past and also really drive the conversation forward in the best way possible. So appreciate you and the other panelists and hope that this is the start of a conversation.
Count on that. Jose?
Thank you. Yes, thank you for the organization of the webinar. As I mentioned before, trade and gender has been discussed for many years in the context of the WTO. It's a more recent discussion, but in a way, it's just the beginning. We launched this report, and we will continue to work on trade and gender, looking at the data, and with data, then we can move to the analysis and give new insights on the relationship between trade and gender, which is highly complex. And so, as I guess, yes, it's just the beginning. Thank you.
Absolutely. Kendall, final thought?
Yeah, I think, for us, we're always looking for ways to improve the way in which we're approaching things. So, we started with a very kind of neat and tidy trade and gender chapter, and have now increasingly moved into looking for opportunities to try to mainstream provisions in chapters, whether it's labor, government procurement, investment, services. And I think that, for us, it's about, I think, always looking for opportunities to learn and to expand and improve. And I mean, the reality is, I think that when we first started talking about trade and gender with some of our trading partners, I mean, this was very new. And we got a lot of comments from countries that, this was impeding on social policies and gender had really no business in a trade agreement. But that's actually changed. And so, I think that, we're talking about a cultural change, right? In terms of how we approach our international trade agreements. And so, I think it requires a mix of patience and persistence. But, I do think that, it requires a little bit of out of the box thinking and not being afraid to try new things and see what the impact is. So, for us, it's a continuous learning process.
Absolutely. So as everyone's hearing, very much a work in progress. And like the WTO, WIT is a member-driven organization as well. So I know all of you have great ideas. These kind of inspiring conversations, they can create so many opportunities for the follow-up. So if you have thoughts or ideas on conversations we should be setting up as a next discussion, we would very much welcome those. For WIT members especially, reminder too that we do some fun things. Andrea mentioned at the outset, we've got our a virtual award ceremony for some of our WIT awards for 2019-2020 this Thursday. So if you haven't signed up already, please do. It's going to be a lot of fun. And I think especially thank you all so much for this incredibly insightful, impactful panel. We really appreciate the partnership, the opportunity to engage and exchange with you. And we will very much look forward to keeping that going. Thanks for being with us today. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Have a great one. Bye-bye.